I sort of feel bad for Ezra Klein because I think there was like this expectation that Harris is going to win the election.
Yeah.
And this was going to be part of like the big neoliberal pushback on the success that Sanders and Warren had in pushing their agenda into the Biden administration, which was greater labor strength and a more robust antitrust regime that would undermine consolidated economic power, which of course also has translated into consolidated political power. And the way that I think, and I don't know that Ezra Klein was the, I don't think he was the mastermind behind this. I think it was obviously, it's like you can go back and you can look and it was like the Nicholson Institute and Cato, I think was a little bit there. I mean, it's like the third way, neoliberal in the most specific way. The idea that the market will provide solutions for society if government is not in the way. And this is an ideology that was, has been prominent for 40 years in this country. And then Harris doesn't win. And then, like, Klein in many instances, he hasn't engaged in the sort of the politics in the same way that he had for years before. But his whole brand was to be to provide analysis that was divorced of ideology and not influenced by political pressure.
Right.
And that shtick worked for a while until people started becoming aware and people became more aware. And, frankly, the terrain changed where people started to understand, like, that supposed absence of ideology isn't in and of itself an ideology.
It's not possible when you're talking about politics.
Well, also the idea that any of this technical, that supposed like policy stuff is divorced from politics is also silly. But like he has an ideology because he's not necessarily going in the way. And then there's also this question of like, there's not many generalists like Klein. Like he cut his teeth by becoming like the generalist expert at healthcare. That was what his big thing was in the run up to the ACA stuff. And it's like, look, I know a lot about Social Security, but if I'm sitting next to someone who's worked on Social Security policy, they know more. But nobody's going to listen to that guy. That guy doesn't have a show.
Right.
That guy's not an op-ed columnist. And so this is sort of, there's a couple of like clips that are out there now of Klein where one was where he was talking about with Jon Stewart, where he was talking about in the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a provision to expand broadband. And he goes on and on, like there was so many roadblocks put up by the Democrats in that legislation that the Democrats have to get out of their way. And then one of Biden's national economic advisors goes like, dude, that was the Republicans.
Yeah.
That was a concession we made to the Republicans to get this bill passed. Like, there's concurrent reporting that show that was what the ask was. Republicans are always, and they'll use regulation as a means to do it, but they're always putting roadblocks up there to prevent corporations from being directed to do stuff. And again, those corporations, incidentally, those cable outlets, what do they have in every region? It's a monopoly. And he would get away with that if we were in a different era where somebody couldn't hop on Twitter and go, dude, there's reporting And Jon Stewart's not supposed to know that.
Right.
And here is another instance where he is on Crooked Media. He's being asked what is like not necessarily like a particularly difficult question.
Although Favreau here does read a very good critique of this book by Zephyr Teachout, who is of the anti-monopolist wing that Sam just kind of described. Very much so. Ran for governor here in New York State, is a good voice on this.
Well,
issue.
she was a colleague of Tim Wu's, who was at one point working in the Biden administration in antitrust and whatnot. And she's also a professor of that as well.
You mentioned some of the critique from the left. I'm sure you've read all of it, or read most of it. I'm sure you've talked about the Zephyr Teachout review of abundance. I wanted to get your reaction to one part of that because I think
we should also just add this is cut up by Crooked Media because there was like a good.
I think it summarizes a lot of the criticism on the left. I mean, you mentioned the Bernie side. There's also a Warren-esque critique as well. And she writes, I still can't tell after reading Abundance whether Klein and Thompson are seeking something fairly small bore and correct, we need zoning reform, or non-trivial and deeply regressive, we need deregulation, or whether there is room within Abundance for anti-monopoly politics and a more full-throated unleashing of American potential. Matt Brunig has a similar critique. He says it would be a huge mistake to sideline whatever focus there is on welfare state expansion and economic egalitarianism in favor of a focus on administrative burdens in construction. It's not a book about like monopolistic.
All right, pause it for 1 second. I just want to walk through what those critiques were. Largely, people have said, critics of the left, of this book, that there are specific provisions in there that sure. And I think, anybody would concede there are good regulations and bad regulations. And having a, evidence-based look at some of these regulations, definitely a worthwhile endeavor. Maybe some should be rolled back on local levels in specific areas. But to promote deregulation in and of itself is a upward redistribution of wealth. Regulations largely inhibit corporate profit making because they basically say, we're not going to allow you to socialize the costs.
Yeah.
And privatize the profits.
Right.
And so that was, that like Zephyr Teachout says, like, I can't tell if this book is meant to be a series of small reforms, which yes,
are acceptable. Yes.
I mean, why wouldn't you?
Yep.
I mean, go around and people say like, hey, we should change regulations so we can build more housing in New York City.
Exactly. Or if it's supposed to be a larger ideological argument against deregulation, or if in this whole calculation of where the Democratic Party should go, if it's this big treatise, where does anti-monopolistic policy fit into this whole sort of milieu?
Yes. And that question, those final two, well, I think it gets answered by Klein, and not in a great way in just a second. But I was more sympathetic to the idea that it was just kind of a small book. And I don't mean to be insulting in that way. But it's the branding of it and the promotion of it, because Klein is a big name, makes it sound like this is the roadmap for the Democrats in the future. Whereas, as Matt just pointed out, folks that are advocates for housing already incorporate these critiques into their vision for affordable housing in this country. But it is maybe, one or two paragraphs? It's a part of the whole. Because absent a repealing of, say, the Faircloth Amendment so that the federal government can fund public housing again, absent broad decommodification, absent going after the private equity firms that are buying up our housing, or the algorithms like RealPage that are artificially inflating rents so that housing is more unaffordable than it's ever been in this country, the part about cutting red tape that we all agree with is not going to have the desired effect. In fact, it may just further commodify housing and empower private interests to raise rents regardless of the supply. So it has to be paired with a vision that takes on corporate power. And so my kind of view of what he was arguing was, I don't know if Klein's hostile to what's being said there, but perhaps the book just, is presented as if it's a bigger vision for the world than it actually is in practice. But the way he responds to Teachout's critique here makes me think that perhaps the instinct that some of us had might have been a bit too generous.
About like monopolistic power practices and corporate concentration. So I get that. I guess to the question that Teachout asked, is there room in abundance for a critique of concentrated economic power and anti-monopoly politics and all that?
I'm trying to think about the nicest way to say this. My friends in the whole problem is oligarchy part of the party, and I believe a good part of our problems are oligarchy. But there are certain kinds of problems they're then willing to see and certain kinds they're not as willing to see. So in housing, I find a lot of them get obsessed with this idea that private investors are buying up a bunch of rental housing. And this is an extremely small part of the market right now, and is just not the main problem in housing. But because it is the villain they are comfortable having, it is where they want to put their focus. Kamala Harris, I was very excited when she brought out her big plan to build 3 million units of housing, but her plan never would have achieved anything like it. It did have a big thing about trying to do something about this private investor buying up housing issue, though. So you can really get, I think, taken off the track. A thing I found really interesting in Zephyr's review was that, is it something good and small like zoning reform? And try doing zoning reform if you think it's small, right? Or something bad like deregulation. Okay, interesting, right?
Yeah.
Deregulation is a word that I think shuts liberals down a bit. And it shouldn't. A lot of what we're pointing out in the book is that the player that is often most regulated is not the market, it's the government itself. If you want to understand why the government can't build public housing effectively, I mean, in many ways, the federal government building public housing is now functionally illegal. It's been regulated out of possibility. If you want to know why we didn't build California high-speed rail, if you want to know why it's so expensive to build affordable housing in a lot of liberal jurisdictions when you trigger public money, it is because of the regulations we put on government.
Okay, here's the point. Who's the we? He says that the oligarchy is not the problem. And what is an oligarchy? An oligarchy is people who have amassed so much economic wealth that we go from a plutonomy to a plutocracy.
Right.
And he says, we put so much of a burden on the government that on itself, that the government can't do things for the public good. Who is the we?
Yep.
Because when we say, does he mean 90% of the people out there? Or does he mean the we being the people who send the lobbyists, who have the money, who buy the elections, who buy the legislature, who provide all of the roadblocks to doing what supposedly we are trying to do? I mean, this is the fundamental flaw in his thinking, is that he thinks there is some sort of entity that is static, that there is no such thing as power dynamics, that he has no sense of power. And this is what has always been absence of his politics. And the reason why you don't recognize power from his position is because you're not on the losing end of it in his politics. The horse knows the rider more than the rider knows the horse.
And when he's talking about the regulations, we, as you say, who is the we that we put on government? I'm not necessarily sure what he means by that. I would have to read more of his book to figure that out. But it seems like he's ignoring the fact that oftentimes this red tape and the lag in delivering for people, it seems like a bit kind of reheated deliverance arguments for the Biden administration from 2020, by the way. The reason that government doesn't deliver for people is because of the regulations we put on government. Or could it be the fact that, unfortunately, we have legalized campaign finance, almost bribery in this country, where there's an influx of corporate money. And on the local level in particular, the yield for corporate interests is higher because they can get more for their money, basically. So there's all this self-dealing that happens on the local level, and they have to take into account this campaign contributor and not run afoul of them if they want to build something here. Or this real estate investor is mad that we want to build affordable housing near their complex or whatever. That's the issue. That's the issue with stuff not being delivered quickly enough. And he seems to ignore that.
Well, that's the whole point. He doesn't even seem to be aware of it, because even in that question, if he had an awareness of it, he would stop and say, he wouldn't say we. Because it's like, who is the we?
Yeah.
Like, are we preventing more public transportation?
Minneapolis literally did zoning reform.
Right.
It's a progressive government. The other thing is like this is all sort of a larger problem of like, how do we get back to building things in America? And it is so insane to me that we are having this concept without reference to, say, the country that's actually building things, which is China. Like, they greenlit flying taxis the other day. They definitely don't have a shortage of housing and things like that. It's not because they're letting the capitalists, bequeath abundance to them. They are controlling their activity strictly and channeling it towards social ends.
Our infrastructure is falling apart, although, the Biden administration did make some good investments in that, but it's not as efficient as it could be because these are subsidies oftentimes for private contractors. And that is where we see, because under capitalism, these guys have to get rich, where we see some of the lack of efficiency and the frustration that he's describing there. And I also just don't understand, when he talks, he mentions there that it's
mentioned some
kind of, I forget his exact phrasing, but when he mentions that it's kind of illegal for the government to build public housing,
shouldn't be.
But why is that the case? That's
that regulation by the capitalists.
He never.
That's the whole point. It's like, it's not like, it's as if it's just sort of like dropped out of the heavens, and we need to be very cautious about this. No, that's not the way legislation is formed. And that's what the very bizarre thing about it. He is standing as if the we is not like an amorphous thing that at different waxes and wanes at different points.
Yeah, it's this annoying kind of habit that I think this
Yes, this is exactly the good point.
But it's this annoying habit of gesturing towards what the left is saying or what critics are saying without addressing it at all.
Well, but see, yes, but what it ultimately is, it's a critique of government. By saying that we can't, government just can't do this.
Yeah.
It is there as if there is something structurally wrong with government, as opposed to there's something structurally wrong with our society. And that being that money is hampering government's ability to do it, because when government does something, it cuts into private money's profit.
Yep.
They don't want public transportation, and that they, in that instance, is the fossil fuel industry.
Or Uber.
Or Elon Musk with his Hyperloop.
And self-driving promises. You can put that in.
I mean, that's the dynamic. That's why the people who are obsessed with oligarchy, it is because it fundamentally, almost definitionally, the existence of an oligarchy undermines the capacity of government to do things that benefit the vast majority of people. That is definitionally the problem with an oligarchy. Not that I hate that guy because look at the way he dresses, or, they have so much money, or just pure. He reduces the issue with oligarchs and with concentrated wealth to an aesthetic.
Right.
As opposed to fundamentally undermining government's capacity to provide for a wide range of people. And again, all governments redistribute wealth and benefit, and it's just a question of which direction does it go.
And yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a theme to respond to your critics that are obsessed with the oligarchy, as he derisively says, while not addressing the problems that oligarchy present to the very part of his book that is being criticized, or the very central thesis to his book. And again, if this was something that was marketed as, hey, these are some friendly tips that local governments can engage in to further along helping their constituents, I don't think the reaction would be what it is. But the fact that it's abundance, and it's on every liberal podcast here, and this is about the vision for the Democratic Party, and you have Josh Shapiro saying, I'm all aboard the abundance agenda train. It is a really bad time to be making this argument.
Well, also,
and it's a really bad time to be making the argument that government is the problem, especially as we have that government is the problem, and also maybe we shouldn't be too focused on the oligarchy, as we have a billionaire oligarch who is destroying our government right now. And so, to the point of, I kind of feel bad for him. It is poorly timed.
I was being facetious.
I know, but that was my first instinct. That was my first instinct, right? Because I wanted to be fair to it. But when I heard how defensive he got about Zephyr Teachout's accurate critique of the book, okay, so we're just reheating neoliberalism again.
We should be extremely angry as a society with the people who have been charged with the economic priorities of this country, which is who Ezra and Derek Thompson are defending with this book, saying we just need to let them cook. Actually, we're behind everywhere. We're behind on green energy. We're behind on personal vehicles. We're behind on, healthcare. We're behind on all of this stuff. And the idea that it's just we need to let the financiers and capitalists decide how to do it. We're back where we were in the New Deal, where we realized actually we need the government to build this stuff, because these people don't actually know how to unleash the productive capacity of this country.
Yeah.
Well, they know how to unleash the productive capacity, their own productive capacity.
Yeah.
The theory has always been pursue your self-interest and it'll be best for society. And the fact is, no, what happens more often than not, and we can see this in the concentration of wealth, is in the pursuit of their own best interest, they necessarily inhibit other people from getting wealth.
And they've all been banking on AI, and now China does that better than us, or at least cheaper than us too.
Yeah, and honestly, it's a little bit frustrating to even have to have this conversation with somebody who is nominally on the liberal or the left side or the Democratic side. The numbers are clear about wealth concentration and how we are at extreme levels that is immiserating the rest of the population. You think that housing is inoculated from that? I mean, I would guess he would say that's too simplistic of an argument, and it's okay. It's a question.
That's exactly what he's saying.
Fine, but
they talk about housing without talking about the 2008 financial crisis. So they're not deep here.
The point is just that it's about what are we emphasizing. We've said this before in the context of being in the news. You have a finite number of things that you can focus on a day-to-day basis. I mean, we're going to always have fun, whatever, on our show, but what you choose to focus on is even more, I think, indicative of your ideology than what you say. And that's the problem with this book.
I don't even care about the book as much as I do the movement. I mean, the fact of the matter is, the fact of the matter is, a guy with a New York op-ed, I mean, these guys are not writing a book that is meant to be small bore, technical housing reform on a small
exactly
level. That's not what they're doing.
How do we square the billionaire circle with the democracy square?
Exactly. This is how do we make the Democratic Party Mark Cuban safe? Hey folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.